Humanity did not announce itself to the galaxy, it was found. 9 years before this story begins, a Threll scouting cruiser drifted too close to a dead system on the edge of human space and picked up a transmission it could not immediately classify. Not a weapon signature, not a distress call, a song, a recording of a mother humming to a child looped and broadcast on an old emergency channel from a colony ship that had gone silent decades earlier. The Threll cataloged it as sentimental noise and moved on. It was the last time any of the older species would underestimate humanity by accident. After that, they did it on purpose, because it was easier to believe a species that hummed to its children could not also break a fleet in half. This is the story of the day they stopped believing that. The outpost was called Corvid Reach, a refueling and relay station built into the hollowed rock of an asteroid 3 light-years past the edge of charted human territory. It had a crew of 112 when the Vashke Accord fleet arrived to inspect it. It had a crew of 1 when they left. Her name was Elin Osei, and she was 34 years old, and she was not a soldier. She was a systems engineer, the kind of person who fixed things quietly and complained about the coffee and kept a photograph of her sister's kids taped to the inside of her locker. She had been assigned to Corvid Reach for a 14-month rotation because the pay was good and the isolation suited her. She had 11 months left when the Vashke ships came out of the dark. The Vashke Accord was not technically an enemy. That was the cruelty of it. They were an alliance of 7 species who had spent 11,000 years perfecting the art of the bloodless conquest. The kind where no formal war is ever declared and no formal surrender is ever signed because both would require acknowledging the other side as an equal. Instead, they inspected. They audited. They arrived at the borders of young species with binding contracts and trade agreements and terms of use so dense that compliance became indistinguishable from ownership within 2 generations. Humanity had been issued its first formal audit notice 8 months earlier. Corvid Reach was the test case. If a station of 100 people could be brought into compliance quietly, the rest of human space would follow without a single shot fired. They arrived in 3 ships, sleek and patient, and they did not open fire, they opened a channel. The voice that came through was translated into something close to warm, because Vashke diplomatic protocol required it, and it informed the station that Corvid Reach was now subject to Accord jurisdiction under statute, that all personnel were to submit to processing, and that resistance would be treated as a breach of neutral status rather than an act of war, which was a distinction that mattered enormously to the Vashke, and not at all to anyone on the receiving end of it. Elin was in the reactor bay when the alarms went silent instead of loud, which was worse. She had spent enough late nights reading the emergency protocols out of boredom to know that a silent alarm meant the station's own defense computer had been locked out remotely before it could even raise a warning. By the time she reached the command deck, the boarding shuttles were already 3 minutes from dock, and the station commander, a good man named Reyes who had never in his life expected to make a decision like this one, was staring at a screen that told him, in flat administrative language, that his station belonged to someone else now. He gave the order to evacuate the civilian and support crew through the auxiliary transports, the slow ones, the ones that would take 2 full days to reach the nearest human relay. He gave the order to keep the fight, if there was going to be one, contained to the 11 souls who chose to stay and buy those transports time. Elin was not on the list of 11. She put herself on it anyway. Nobody remembers exactly what happened in the first 40 minutes, because nobody who could describe it in detail survived it. What is known, because the Vashke kept meticulous records and those records were later recovered, is that Corvid Reach's skeleton crew did not fight the way the Accord's tactical models predicted a young, undisciplined species would fight. They did not panic. They did not cluster for a doomed last stand at the command deck. They scattered into the station's maintenance arteries, the crawl spaces and coolant tunnels that Elin herself had mapped a dozen times over boring double shifts, and they made the Vashke boarding parties pay for every meter of a station that had never been designed to be defended, because it had never needed to be. By the 90-minute mark, 10 of the 11 were dead. Reyes was among them, killed holding a bulkhead door shut long enough for the last transport to clear the docking ring. Elin did not know that when it happened. She only knew hours later, crouched in a coolant duct 3 decks down with a fabrication torch in one hand and no working comm, that the station had gone quiet in a way that told her she was probably the only one left breathing. There is a detail in the Vashke tactical logs that human historians tend to skip over, because it does not fit neatly into the version of the story people prefer to tell, and that is this: Elin was not fighting well by any professional standard. She had never held a weapon in combat before that day. She burned her hand badly rerouting the coolant manifold and kept working with it wrapped in a strip torn from her own jacket. Twice she triggered her own traps early, once nearly killing herself in a corridor she had flooded with vapor moments before she needed to pass back through it. A trained soldier would have died in the first 20 minutes. What kept Elin alive for 6 hours was not skill. It was a refusal to stop making the next small decision, over and over, long after the large decision whether to survive at all had stopped feeling like something she was choosing and started feeling like something she simply was. The Vashke commander, a tactician named Sarai Voth who had overseen 11 such inspections in her career and never once needed longer than 3 hours to secure full compliance, made a decision at that point that would be studied by human strategists for the next 2 decades. She ordered her boarding parties to stop hunting and to wait. It was not mercy, it was curiosity. Her sensors told her exactly one human remained active on a station that should have contained none, and her translators had over the preceding hours intercepted enough of that human's private communications, murmured to herself in the dark because the silence was unbearable otherwise, to register something her species did not have adequate vocabulary for. Not tactics, not training, something closer to refusal. She opened a direct channel to Elin's suit frequency, patched through a relay her tech teams had cracked 2 hours earlier, and she asked in that same warm administrative translation why she was still fighting a battle that was already lost. Elin's answer, preserved in Vashke records and later in human ones, was 4 words long: "You haven't left yet." Voth found this either irrational or magnificent and could not immediately decide which. She ordered a probe of the coolant tunnels instead of a purge, wanting, for reasons she would later struggle to explain to her own command, to see this creature rather than simply erase it. It was the second decision that would be studied for decades. What the probe found was a woman who had, in the space of 6 hours, turned a service corridor built for routine maintenance into a corridor that killed anything that entered it. She had rerouted coolant lines to flood specific junctions with superheated vapor on a timer. She had rigged the station's own automated welding drones, harmless machines meant for hull repair, into mobile turrets running on a jury-rigged targeting script she had written from memory because she'd once been bored enough to read the drone's full documentation on a slow shift. She had turned scrap metal and spare fabrication stock into a minefield disguised as debris. None of it was elegant, all of it worked. Voth pulled her forces back a second time and did something no Vashke commander had done in the 11,000-year history of the Accord's expansion. She requested a formal audience. It took place 4 hours later over open channel, broadcast without Elin's knowledge or consent to the full Vashke command fleet, and unbeknownst to either of them, intercepted and relayed onward by a human listening post that had picked up the transmission by accident and passed it up every chain it could reach, because someone on that listening post recognized what they were hearing and understood that the entire species needed to hear it too. Voth asked Elin why a support technician, not a soldier, had fought for 6 hours against a boarding force she could not possibly defeat, when surrender would have ended the violence and quite likely spared her life. Elin's voice on that recording is steady in a way that does not match the blood loss the medical logs would later confirm she was already experiencing from a fragment wound in her side. She said that she had grown up on a world with hurricanes, and that every autumn her town would board up windows it knew perfectly well would not hold, not because the boards would win, but because boarding them up was the difference between something that happened to you and something you let happen to you. She said humanity had spent its entire short history in that same posture, up against forces vastly larger than itself, and had never once found the trick to making the storms go away. What it had found over and over in ice ages and famines and wars it started and wars it didn't was that it could choose how it stood while the storm was still coming. She said the Vashke Accord could take Corvid reach. It had in every practical sense already done so. But it was not going to get to say that humanity handed it over, because that part, the only part that had ever actually belonged to her, was not for sale, audit or no audit. Voth pressed her once more because 11 previous inspections had taught her that people said brave things when they still believed there was a way out, and she wanted to know whether the answer would hold once that belief was gone. She told Elin plainly, without cruelty, that no relief force was coming in time, that the transports she had bought were already clear and safe and did not need another hour bought on their behalf, and that continued resistance now would change nothing except how much pain remained between this moment and the end of it. She asked, one more time, whether Elin understood that she was choosing to suffer for a symbol rather than survive for a reason. Elin's answer to that second question is the one most often quoted, and the one most often misunderstood. She did not say she was fighting for humanity, or for the Accord to see something, or for history. She said she was fighting because the last thing Commander Reyes had said to her over comms, before his channel went silent for good, was that he needed the transports to have time, and that as far as she knew, she still hadn't confirmed to herself that time was fully spent. She said she would rather be wrong about that and die for nothing than be right about it and never have checked. It was not defiance dressed up as strategy. It was something closer to a promise she had made to a dead man and had not yet finished keeping. Voth was silent on the recording for 11 full seconds, which for a species that processed speech at nearly twice human speed was closer to a full minute of human hesitation. What happened next is a matter of official record. The Vashke Accord withdrew its inspection fleet from Corvid Reach within the hour, formally reclassifying the station's status from non-compliant to disputed, a bureaucratic distinction that bought humanity something it had never had before: time, and a seat, however small, at the edge of a table it had not been invited to. Voth's report to Accord High Command, later obtained through channels neither government has ever officially acknowledged, did not describe humanity as weak or as a threat. It described them as a species that had not yet learned it was supposed to lose, and warned with unusual bluntness for a vast tactical filing that any commander who mistook that ignorance for something that could be corrected through force alone was going to learn the lesson at a cost the Accord would not enjoy paying. Elin Osei was recovered by a human relief convoy 11 days later alive, because the coolant duct she'd retreated to also happened to be adjacent to the station's emergency medical cache, and because she was, it turned out, exactly as good at keeping herself alive as she had been at keeping a 112-person station out of someone else's hands for 6 hours longer than anyone had a right to expect. She did not think of herself as the reason anything changed. In every interview she gave afterward, and she gave very few, she said the same thing in different words, that she had not been trying to make a point to an alliance of 7 species watching from orbit. She had been trying to make sure that if Corvid Reach fell, it fell because it was overwhelmed, not because it gave up, and that the difference mattered to her more than her own survival did, in the moment, in a way she still found difficult to fully explain afterward. But the galaxy did not experience it as a private act. The recording spread. Species that had never had reason to think about humanity beyond a line item in an audit schedule listened to 11 seconds of Vashke silence and drew their own conclusions. Diplomatic postures shifted in ways too small to trace to a single cause and too consistent to be coincidence. 3 other Accord inspections scheduled for human systems that year were quietly postponed. A tactician named Sarai Voth, who had spent a career teaching junior officers that compliance was simply a matter of applying sufficient and proportionate pressure, submitted 6 months later an addendum to Accord doctrine recommending that any future contact protocol involving humanity include, as a standing clause, the assumption that the species would rather lose everything than be told it had nothing left to lose. The Corvid Reach was never fully repaired. Human Engineering Command debated for years whether to decommission it or rebuild it, and in the end did neither. They left the coolant tunnels exactly as Elin had rigged them, sealed but intact, a small dark maze at the edge of known space that no visiting delegation, human or otherwise, has ever been allowed to walk without an escort and a great deal of context. Elin went back to fixing things. She turned down every offer to become something else, a symbol, a spokesperson, a face for a species that badly wanted one. She said more than once that the moment had never belonged to her personally, that it belonged to a town that boarded up windows it knew wouldn't hold, and to everyone before her who had ever stood in a doorway they could not actually defend and stayed there anyway, because leaving would have meant admitting something that wasn't true. Humanity did not win that day. It is important to be precise about that because the story gets told wrong more often than it gets told right. Corvid Reach was still lost in every material sense for 6 hours, to a fleet it never had any real chance of repelling. Nothing about the outcome changed the fact that Elin Osei was outnumbered, outgunned, and by every reasonable measure available to either side, already defeated before the first boarding shuttle ever docked. It is tempting, telling it now, to make the story bigger than it was. To imagine Elin as something other than a tired, frightened, badly injured woman who had spent the previous 11 months complaining about the station's coffee and missing her sister's kids' birthdays, and who found herself on one ordinary Tuesday doing the only thing she could think to do with the hours she had left. She was not chosen for this. She did not train for it. She was simply the last person still standing in a place that mattered, and she decided that standing was still worth doing even when nothing else was left to do with it. That is a smaller kind of story than the one the recruitment broadcasts eventually made of it, and it is, for exactly that reason, the truer one. What she changed was smaller than a victory and has turned out in the years since to matter considerably more. She changed what it cost to assume humanity would simply comply. She made the next audit slower, and the one after that slower still, and somewhere in all that accumulated slowness, humanity found the room it needed to grow into something the Vashke Accord could no longer safely audit at all. There is a recording, still classified in most human archives but not strangely in most Vashke ones, of Sarai Voth's voice, asking a wounded engineer in a dying station why she was still fighting a battle that was already lost. And somewhere out past the edge of charted space, in a sealed maintenance corridor that nobody walks alone, the answer is still true. You haven't left yet.